Initiating stream.
I'll check it on the other screen, but it looks like we're away.
How are we going on my side? And we're live on my side. Welcome, welcome, welcome everyone to the chat. It's the Crypto Lark and Alex from Nuggets News. Welcome, everyone.
Hi, guys. We're going to chat about politics and how it's going to relate to crypto. And I think it's going to be one of the things that makes crypto boom, but everyone seems to think there's no relationship there.
Well, it's always fascinating for me when people say, dude, stick to crypto, don't talk about politics-y stuff. But actually, politics, it's all about politics. And I just always refer back to the Genesis block of Bitcoin when it comes to literally what Satoshi decided to put in there, right? It's the chancellor on the brink of a second bailout for the banks, right? Like this, all this stuff comes in so important in terms of, what actually comes down. I think you were muted there for a second. So say hi to everyone on my side again.
Oh, I was muted on your end, was I?
Yeah, sorry, that was my fault.
Oh, okay. Hi, guys. We are live. 25 watching on my end as well, Lark. So one of the things I wanted to talk about today was a few of the things that have happened in the past, because I think a lot of people forget that back in the day when we had those events in Cyprus or Greece, even when India banned the high denomination notes, all these geopolitical events was what really sparked big Bitcoin rallies. And now everyone's hoping for an ETF or backed or some of these, investing instruments in the US in one country. But I think it's going to be not a black swan, but something that people aren't really putting much weight in at the moment. That's probably going to drive a big rally next year.
Oh, absolutely. There's so much possibility for these kind of big events happening in the world to push people towards crypto. And it's so important because, like what happened in Cyprus boggles my mind, right? The government literally went and took 10% of everyone's deposit accounts. Just imagine that. Your government screwed up so bad and they managed the economy so bad that they stole 10% of your money.
And that's on top of already printing money and lowering interest rates and trying to do everything they can to sort of, that secret theft where you don't really notice that purchasing power being eroded and slowly worn down. And then all of a sudden they go, yeah, that didn't all work, so we're going to take 10% of all your money.
Yeah, we'll just keep taking it. We take it through inflation, we take it through taxes, and on it goes. It's wild. It's wild how much money the governments are taking. And this kind of comes back a little bit to where we're talking about cryptocurrencies, right? Because when you give money to your government, it just disappears into some kind of black hole. And, you look at the unaccountability of how government spending actually happens. Okay, we spent, a couple $100 million on that, but what did you do? What were the results? There's very little financial accountability for what the governments are actually spending your money on.
Yeah. And you're allowed to spend your money in that circumstance. So local Bitcoin's volume in Cyprus was through the roof. People were going, I have to buy now and get my money out of this bank before the haircut comes, and they take 10%. So what are we seeing now? Similar, I guess, Lark, in other countries where France at the moment's got the yellow vest protest going on. People aren't happy about the amount of tax and this high cost of living in countries. And France is one of those countries where it's not just a little sort of Venezuela that's not that familiar to people. Everybody knows France. So if something happens there, it's going to be headlines all over the world.
Exactly. It's not Cyprus, and it's not even Greece. It's like I always thought it was funny that Britain's going to be allowed to leave, but Greece kind of wasn't allowed to leave when they were wanting to potentially do that. But anyway, that's besides the point. The Yellow Jackets. It's very interesting to see this kind of mass popular uprising against really what are the failed policies of neoliberalism. We've had now what are they talking about doing? Well, let's sell off all of our public assets that actually make money for the country. Let's increase taxes on the poor and the middle class. Let's increase taxes on pensioners. If I have ever heard of a dumb political move, it is increasing taxes on pensioners. Like that's like the sacred cow. You don't screw with the pensioners, man. They're your biggest voting force that'll get you back in next time. But people like Macron may not actually be very interested in getting reelected. It's about get in, fix it for the elites, essentially, because remember, no matter who's in office, they always win. And what we see now is giant tax cuts again coming for the wealthy in France. And so one idea that I put out, and a lot of people don't like this idea for whatever reason, because I think it's new and it's scary and all these different things. They assume everything's going to get hacked and all this stuff. But actually having governing referendums by the citizens based on the blockchain, e-voting backed up on the blockchain for security and authenticity and all that fun stuff so that people can't actually go in and manipulate the votes. But I mean, what do you think about this? Do you think that our future might actually move towards such a situation where we have some kind of voting happening on the blockchain like that?
Yeah, and we've covered Horizon State a lot. There's another Australian project called ClearPoll, and there's plenty of out there that are talking about doing voting. But I think the numbers are that it saves cost by 98%. But I really envision everyone has a smartphone. 95% of people in France would have a smartphone. Now, everyone knows how to download an app. If it's in all the local newspapers saying, hey, on this date, you've got to download this app and you can vote if you're in favor of this or if you're not. And if the politicians sit there and get told that, 80% of people think this is ridiculous, they're probably going to go, oh, geez, maybe we are a bit detached from reality. Rather than now, when people take to the streets and start burning and looting and all this sort of thing, I definitely think that ease of just being able to get an answer very quickly through those apps is a huge solution.
Yeah. Now, let's take it one step farther. Let's incentivize people to do it. In Australia, you guys actually punish people if they don't vote. I think it's about a $200 fine, right?
Even local state government elections, $25, $50 fines as well, yeah.
See, there you go. This is the thing, is that you could be punished for not voting, like it's already happening in Australia. It already happens, guys. For everyone out there who thinks this could ever happen, punish people for not voting, like it's you're a citizen participating in a governing of your entire country. You need to participate, right? This is part of the responsibilities being a citizen, right? So you either get fined for not voting. So if you don't want to vote, pay the money. But if you do vote, maybe there's some kind of a financial reward on it. Maybe everyone gets $1 for voting or something like this. It's just an idea.
Yeah, I mean, if those elections are $100 per person and we're getting the cost down to $2 per person by doing it with an app, why not give someone $5 or $10 and you still come out $90 ahead as the government and you've given them an incentive? So moving over in Europe a little bit towards Brexit, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this because I think they're playing this game of chicken where they want everyone to think that this is going to be the worst thing ever. And unless we come to some solution, they want to set an example of how bad it is for anyone to go out against the system and say they want to leave the euro. They really want to make an example, and they don't want this to be seen to be easy at all.
Yeah, Brexit's a crazy thing because it's one of those situations where theoretically everyone's better off, collaborating together, having free and open markets and all this stuff. And the promise of these populist parties is that we should leave the EU and then when it actually happened, all the leaders of that movement immediately resigned and disappeared from public, which has said a lot actually. Yeah. And then Theresa May was left to kind of carry that mantle forward. But I think if there was a second vote on it, people probably wouldn't vote to leave now that they've had a lot of time to talk about it and actually think about what that entails and means. But I can understand where the populists pushed that narrative and how that narrative was successful in pushing it. But yeah, what will it mean for Bitcoin? I don't know.
Yeah, I think coming back to Bitcoin and the bond market and the idea that all this risk is mispriced. So with the euro, when they did their bond buying program, their version of QE, and they're saying, we're going to buy Greek and Italian bonds, and they're at interest rates lower than the US or Australia. So these countries that are super, super risky, that are super indebted, and the euro's saying, it's all okay. These are these band-aid solutions that strain the system, trying to say, no, Italy is just as good as Germany, for example. And this is this new reality we live in where it's all falsehoods. It's all this illusion that everything's fine, and it's not.
Sounds like a conspiracy theory, mate. But it's the funny thing is that it's so easy to discredit things because, there have been so many situations where there have been these outlandish lies that are total BS. But at the same time, that covers up all the times the governments have lied to us, all the times that we've been lied to by the big banks, the big financial institutions. I mean, just look at 2008. This is the perfect example. If anybody thinks this isn't going to happen again, it is, because they're setting up the stage to let all the things happen again. What happened? The ratings agencies were all lying. They all knew that this was all dirty, bad debt that could never be actually paid. And they're swapping it around. And they lied because it was just what was done. if we think that those ratings agencies aren't going to lie again, that the big banks aren't going to lie again, and that they aren't profiting off of this boom bust cycle of ramping up the economy and then crashing it, ramping up the economy and then crashing it. Regular people get crushed. This is why we've seen so much wealth moving up, because our society is inherently unrepresentative, right? Which comes back to our idea of, blockchain based voting for people. Actually, imagine if we could all vote on the budget, right?
Yeah. The other thing there is before the last GFC, Ben Bernanke, who was the US Federal Reserve Chairman, came out and said that everything's fine. The economy has never been chugging along better. That's just months before the biggest financial collapse in the world happened. And then we see them get out of office, and people like Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke are now telling people to buy gold. And then Janet Yellen came out last week and said, oh, there's gigantic holes in the system. And last year she was saying we'll never see another crisis in our lifetime. So it's kind of like, why are these people lying and creating this picture that everything's rosy? And then once they're out of office, they're saying, oh, geez, I'm telling you something bad's happening and I want to be right. But they were the cause of the problem in the first place.
Well, I know this is the thing. It again gives that idea that people who are put in these positions of power actually have any power. They often don't, right? They're figureheads. They get out and repeat what they're told to repeat largely. And in terms of actually moving the direction, I mean, look at people. Yeah, it's a perfect example. They knew what was happening. And as soon as they get out of office and don't have to say that anymore, they're not beholden to say that anymore. They say, actually, you guys should be buying gold because this whole ship's sinking. But that's crazy. They had the chance to do something, and of course they didn't do it because maybe their hands were tied. And that might sound like crazy and conspiratorial, but again, look at the facts. Look at what's actually happened in history, and it says a lot.
And last week in Australia, we saw them come out and say, if there was a downturn, we would have to drop interest rates to zero and print money. And it's like, oh my gosh, aren't you telling us that the economy is so great and that housing is going to be fine? And here you are making plans for a recession at a time when everything should be booming.
That's it. And, it's these property markets are absolutely wild. I mean, what happened in New Zealand? The government just let the property markets go insane for the longest time. And now New Zealand is one of the most unaffordable countries for regular humans to buy a house in, because we had, from the time that I first moved to New Zealand up until only a couple months ago, foreign speculators were able to easily buy multiple houses in New Zealand, never even had to come here once. They could buy 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 houses, speculate them. There are plenty of stories of houses being sold 3 or 4 times in one day in Auckland, right? And that kind of situation makes it so somebody who's making $50,000 a year, it's almost impossible to buy a house. Or if you can buy a house, you're going to be indebted to the bank for the next 30 years of your life and pay, 2.5 or 3 times the actual value of that house, which we're given so much power to the banks, but it's such a hard system to escape.
Yeah, and I've read some stories about the amount of money that was just purely laundered through Canada, New Zealand, and Australia was one of the worst for the little amount of documents that they require for these houses to be purchased. And then, as you say, if something's getting flipped 4 times in one day, that sounds a lot to me like going to the casino and laundering your money.
Yep. But hey, Bitcoin's the problem, right? It's the big money laundering tool. It's the big speculative bubble, right?
Yeah. So just to tie this all together for people at home, if real estate does come down, it tends to weaken confidence in the economy, and we tend to have a downturn or a sideways period. And that's when a lot of people start to ask, well, what's going on? In Australia, we've had 27 years of uninterrupted growth. People have never seen a rainy day. And I think this is going to spark a lot of interest in Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and just how does money work again.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an alternative asset class that, in spite of how many people might have heard of it, you have to realize that a lot of people who have heard the name Bitcoin, it's usually been in coordination with criminal activity, money laundering, terrorism, the herding of puppies, right? This is what it's always kind of comes down to. And that's just not true. It's just not true. Every statistic that's ever come out about Bitcoin payments shows that it's an incredibly fractional amount of what's going on.
Yeah. The next topic we wanted to discuss was the US-China trade wars.
Ooh, good one.
Donald Trump's here now, and the US has actually become, I think they're the number 1 oil producer in the world now because of all the shale and fracking and stuff that they do. And then we see that create another dynamic with OPEC and all those Middle Eastern nations. So it's really interesting to watch how this all plays out when China's trying to become the number 1 economy, or I think they have already passed that on some metrics, but very interesting to watch this play out.
Yeah, I mean the trade war thing when it really comes down to it, it's populism kind of stuff. But I think the bigger picture of basically the US not being the world's sole superpower anymore is the real question that we have to sort of grapple with here. And China will be the next number one superpower. It's going to happen in the next few years. And some people don't like that. And I think there's a lot of things that are going on in China that are really, really messed up, like the social credit system and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like you have to keep it real. China's like got some really dystopian kind of stuff going on. But on the flip side, China's also like the biggest producer of, renewables, like solar panels and stuff like that. They're making more than anyone else. They're deploying more than anyone else. Like that also is part of the picture. Whereas the US is doubling down on oil production, China's doubling down on renewables. Yeah. So it's with any country, there's no it's never black or white. It's those are the good guys, those are the bad guys. It's some kind of gray. Everyone does kind of messed up stuff, but I think the wider implications though for de-dollarization could be really, really massive. And I mentioned this in a video recently about how the Russian central bank has put out a notice to smaller banks in the country, like there's an eventuality, guys, that we might actually be cut off from the international financial system because of what the US does. And it's really interesting because Russia hasn't really done anything additional since, a couple years ago in the Ukraine situation. So if Ukraine's still a justification, it doesn't make any sense anymore. And it's a lot of pot kettle black kind of stuff. But were that actually to happen, that could be the black swan event that essentially boosts crypto massively, because all of a sudden Russia could, this is a could, we of course have no actual indication that this is what will happen, but it could certainly move towards crypto-based solutions for international payments. Russia's already been de-dollarizing. They trade now their oil with Egypt for Egyptian pounds. They trade their oil with China for Chinese yuan, and I think with Turkey as well. So that move towards de-dollarization is slowly happening. And countries that need to do it the most are the ones who are doing it, but others will start to follow suit because the current international financial system is inherently hypocritical and in a lot of ways kind of racist in the way that it directly operates against certain countries while ignoring other countries and bad things they do.
Yeah, and gold is something else that they've been starting to settle in as well now, but it's just that fact of we're not going to keep letting the US print dollars, and we don't know how many they're printing. And if you're Russia or China and on the US, and every time I buy something off you, I'm just giving you money, you don't know that I'm not just printing that money out of thin air, which they are doing, but they don't know to what extent. Whereas if you can't turn around and print a lot of money, the US is going to go, hold on, where did you get that from? But yet everything's backed by nothing, and that's where we're seeing this whole dynamic of we don't trust each other anymore because it's all backed by nothing.
Well, that's it. And that's where it comes down to this, nearing $22 trillion of U.S. debt. It just doesn't work. I mean, just imagine if it was you or I, and we went to our bank and said, hey, I know I'm $22 trillion in debt, but can I have another couple trillion next year? Like everyone would say no, but because it's the U.S., because it has been the institutional superpower for a few decades now, everyone kind of says, yeah, they're good for it. They'll pay it off eventually. But I feel like people in the know understand that that's not going to get paid off. There's no practical way unless you print money, but that then devalues the currency to the point where you're basically ending the U.S. anyway, right?
I remember the U.S. government shutdowns, and they all they rock up to these important meetings with their ties on, and they raise the debt ceiling, and then 2 years later they hit it again, and they have these big conversations, and then they raise the debt ceiling. It's the biggest joke ever, like just continually piling on the debt and trying to act like, oh, we're going to be responsible, we're not going to hit that in the next 2 years' time. And then every time they get there, they just kick the can down the road.
Yeah, well, that's right. No politicians that have been elected in a very long time have done anything in almost any major country to move the world forward, right? Everyone's kicking the can down the road. Everyone's too concerned about their next election to actually do anything, which again gives us back to that idea of we need to be empowered as citizens to make decisions about the world outside of our once every 4 or 5 year, like, okay, we get to go and vote for the red team or the blue team, but no matter who we vote for, the result's going to be exactly the same.
That's a great point. I read an article the other day that says the average politician wage now is, well in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. They want to keep their job. They don't want to ruffle any feathers and maybe try and change something a little bit. So the whole dynamic it creates is no change, where people want change and want their opinions heard, whereas the politicians actually want to do whatever's not going to change the most, so they get their salary and they get to sit in parliament for a few more years and then retire
Mhm.
on their nice compensation packages and so on.
Well, even better, if you do well enough as a politician, when you get voted out of office, you get to go and get an even higher paying job at the industries you were supposed to be regulating, but you didn't regulate. You let them regulate themselves, and then they give you a sweet, $500,000 a year job because you played ball.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? Other questions I had was about, I guess, about OPEC and the Middle East there, and the shift that we want to see towards renewables. Australia's still exporting coal to me, which is crazy in a
Oh
sun-bathed
man,
country like us that should be using Power Ledger or all the other great solar projects out there to become renewable.
it's wild to see how far behind we are on renewables because I think like New Zealand and Australia, this is again total lack of political will and total representation of complete political cowardice. There is no reason that both of our countries couldn't be 100% renewable, all electric vehicles, all electric. Like, good God, Australia, there's so much renewable energy. It's insane. Absolutely insane. But we keep dragging our feet. We keep doubling down on these industries that are completely unprofitable. I mean, Australia, they give like $1 billion to Adani or something to help keep doing what's basically a sunset industry. It
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense. So they could have spent that on renewables, right?
Yeah, the percent of the population that lives near the coast for wind energy, let alone the solar, it just does my head in. Even in somewhere like Tasmania, where I live, there's so many hydro dams that have just been decommissioned. They're just sitting there and they're just sources of renewable energy, but no one has, the guts to do some sort of infrastructure program. And we have like some of the most expensive power there is, and we have all these hydro dams sitting around just doing nothing.
Yeah, it's absolutely wild. But again, this just goes back to this. If regular citizens actually had the choice, right? I know we get promised a lot of stuff by politicians who then do the exact opposite as soon as they get into elected office. I've also posited the idea before about smart contracts for politicians, right? So let's say we're going to elect, a new MP for our local region. Well, we say, hey, you know what? We want to make sure that you're committed to renewables and that you're committed to installing 10,000 new solar panels in our region within the first year. And he says, oh, yeah, sure. Okay. Sign the smart contract. And if you don't do that, that automatically sends your resignation letter in and we find someone new.
Yeah, it's a bit like
Right.
the staged ICO funds. You only get to unlock your salary or the next part of your funding if you meet these goals, which is something I'd love to see going forward.
Absolutely. And all these ideas, I know that a lot of people think that some of these ideas are, kind of crazy and we can never do this stuff. But the only thing that we keep doing as society is moving forward. And like right now, like our electoral process is so antiquated. Like it's wild. They literally thought up this stuff 200 years ago. Like look at the technology we've had since then, and where there's been very little change. I mean, recently in New Zealand, back in the 90s, we voted for a different electoral system, which is much more representative than it was before. It's still not perfect by any means, but it's way better than it was before. We've got a much wider plurality of parties now, but I think in Australia, you guys are still doing the first past the post in every like electorate, and like you have to win like a physical geography in order to get a seat, right?
Yeah, it's honestly something that I need to look into more because I turn a blind eye to a lot of it because nothing does get done a lot of the time, and we get a new prime minister every second year, and honestly it doesn't matter to me who's in these positions because it's just such a butting of heads and nothing gets
Yeah,
done. So it is
and
that private industry that I wish had more tax breaks, and we have some of the highest rates of tax in the world. People are already, we talk to these tech startups and they say, well, we're outsourcing this to Asia, to this country because it's 3 times as cheap.
That's it. Well, and I saw recently, I think it was 1 in 3 companies in Australia didn't pay any tax last year.
Yeah, that's right. 722 didn't pay any tax. And I was saying in my video
You
last
try to
night,
not pay tax and see what happens, right? As a
no,
person.
like as Nuggets News, and we employ about 5 people now, and we have paid that much money in GST for our professional services that we do, as well as tax, and I just think, imagine if the startups had a bit of a tax break in the first year or two. I'd be hiring more people and trying to get, more support for other startups. But instead, I'm just handing over all this money to the government. And, in a bear market, we're struggling, I guess, to get by like everyone. And it just does my head in how much easier it would be to live in any other country to be a startup.
Yeah, well, that's it. I kind of feel a similar situation here in New Zealand. It's a very it's technically easy to start a business. You can do it in like about an hour or two here in New Zealand, but once you've actually done it, well, then what, right? Unless you're a big guy, then you get all these benefits. I was reading about high net worth individuals earlier, and if you're a multi-billionaire, you probably never pay almost anything in taxes because you can just set up a shell company in Ireland and you just offshore all your profits and onshore all your losses, so you get tax breaks back from your local government. And
yeah, that's
it's
another interesting point. I've watched a good documentary recently about how that all started, the Canary Islands, and how many businesses are set up there, and it's more than the entire population of the whole district. And they're going to crack down on that apparently. But if they do, to any real extent, I only see that moving more money into crypto. I'm not sure if you watched the TV show Billions, where they're talking about how to transfer money in offshore accounts and avoid, prying eyes, and they're talking about using Bitcoin. It's starting to get out there.
so interesting. Well, this is what it comes down to, is that this stuff always goes on. There's always offshoring, there's always crime, there's always all this stuff. And cryptocurrency is another venue for that to happen in, because essentially crypto's money, right? And money will always have what money does, right? People are going to go out and pay for, drugs or prostitutes or money launder money or any of this stuff, right? Some of it's technically illegal, some of it's morally questionable, whatever, right? But people are going to keep doing that. And that's kind of weird when you think about it, that the governments tell us what we can and cannot spend our money on, right? And this perhaps goes back to a wider question of actual freedom, right? Because if I were to take my credit card, I could not take my credit card and buy marijuana here in New Zealand, right? And so that's the government censoring my ability to buy things. As one small example.
Yeah, that's something that gets talked about a lot. And with my pharmacy background, the studies show that if you legalize a lot of this stuff, it just gets rid of the black market. And those crime task forces can focus on things that have a far better return on expenditure, stopping abuse or other things, rather than, instead of cracking down on these drug cartels for these industries that should be regulated, standardized. I very much think, just like anyone can buy marijuana if they want it, anyone can buy these other drugs if they want it, but people are paying a higher price for it. And again, if they came down in price, people would spend their money on other productive things in the economy. So just another example of straining things. The system's not working. You talk to police in these industries, and they tell you that it's a bit of a joke. They know that they're not really making any difference, but it's just the way it is.
Just the way it is, right? And that goes across so many industries. It's just the way it is. It's just the way we've always done it. Therefore, we will continue doing it. In your opinion, is there any drug that shouldn't be at least, I guess, decriminalized or made legal?
I think you can. For me, it's definitely, first off, it's plants. So if it grows in nature, a lot of the time that has more harmony with the body and how it works and the side effects profile. So I think we start there. And then, obviously, we don't want to make things like ice. But I think people turn to these other drugs when they crack down to some degree on these friendlier drugs. And then from China now we have fentanyl coming in because they've cracked down on, heroin. And so it just creates a darker market. And I don't think people are going to use these horrific drugs. A lot of these addicts don't want to be on these drugs, but they've had to turn to something else. So I think,
and because they're criminalized, right? They keep going deeper.
Yes. So I think if you create education, standardization, just as any 18-year-old kid can go and drink vodka every day, but they don't because it's not cool or healthy. If any 18-year-old kid could do ecstasy or smoke marijuana every day, it doesn't mean they're just going to do it because it's there all of a sudden. Their friends go, it's not even illegal. It's not cool to do that every day, and you're gonna feel pretty ordinary within a few days. So it's just like anything. I think common sense and education could really do such a better job.
Absolutely, and instead of what we see now is that kid, that random 18-year-old kid we're going to throw into the bus here. He goes out and he smokes a joint and he smokes it for a couple days, and then the cops bust him and he ends up going to jail, right? Or he gets a criminal record, and for what point? Because he was experimenting with some weed when he was a kid. Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? And if he does get addicted to like heroin or something going down the road, well, instead of throwing him in jail, maybe use all the tax money that you got from, having pharmacists being able to give heroin to people. As some might find that an extreme view, but it's better for them to get it from a freaking pharmacist than to get it from some back alley heroin dealer, which might be selling you God knows what. But then at least that person can get help. They come into the pharmacy again, and the pharmacist says, "Man, been in here a lot this week. You might really want to, look at some of these programs we have to help you get off this. Yeah. This is not the answer to whatever you're feeling in your life."
And all the evidence shows that if you give people more meaning to their lives, instead of throwing them in jail, you get them a job at the local mechanic. And you say to the mechanic, I'll pay half this person's wage if you give them a job and a meaning to their life for a year. All the evidence and study shows that gets someone out of that rabbit hole and that circle of addiction. So instead, we're throwing people in jail where they're still doing hard drugs and coming out. And what's the first thing they do? They can go and do whatever they want again. So
exactly, and it just doesn't work. It's a broken system among the many. A few people in the comment section here are saying big pharma is scared of marijuana curing diseases. Jake the Red says that his mom is taking opioids for severe chronic pain, and he suggested CBD oil, and her doctors won't even consider it as an option.
There's a plant there's a plant that grows throughout Asia called kratom. And it is really it's cured hundreds of thousands of people in the US from their opioid addictions. So everything from heroin to fentanyl, oxycodone, and that the numbers are crazy. The percentage of the world's population that's addicted to it, it's all in America. So Big Pharma have pumped out these drugs. Everyone's addicted, and kratom is a natural relief. So it's a natural painkiller. It stops the addiction to these opiates. And Big Pharma have found out about it, and they're trying to make it illegal. And there was
Of course they are. Let's make this tea illegal. That helps people.
Yeah, so there was tens of thousands of people that rallied on Washington, and I've had this pushed back a year because this is a powder, a plant that you can buy in a lot of these natural food stores. And there's a fantastic documentary called A Leaf of Faith that I recommend everyone watch about this concept. All these people whose lives it helped, but Big Pharma want to make it illegal because it's getting people out of their addiction and hurting their profits.
Well, and this is something we can actually bring this back around to blockchain, because I see, we look at big pharma and the effect that it has on, the drug market, right? Well, essentially what you see is that why is kratom being cracked down on? Why is marijuana illegal? Because the big pharmaceutical companies keep bribing the politicians who keep voting against any kind of initiatives that might get put forward. Now, let's imagine that if when you went to vote for a politician, I don't think we even need politicians in the future, but let's just say we go and vote for a politician, and that you see Bob and John and Sally, right? And you scan Bob and you just see, okay, well, where's Bob stand on the issues, and who's he taken money from in the past year or the past 3 years or 3 years? And when you look and see, okay, this guy's voted against every marijuana issue, and I'm very pro-marijuana, for example, and he's taken money from all the big pharmaceutical companies, well, you can kind of make that direct connection. Oh, he's getting paid off to vote against this stuff. I'm not going to vote for this guy. I'm going to vote for Sally, who's voted, for marijuana things, and she's taking money from the big marijuana companies or whatever, because that's, how politics is done.
Yeah. Unfortunately, money does run the world, and getting that on a blockchain, it's all about transparency, isn't it? That's the thing that frustrates me most with politics and central banking. And in the GFC, who did they give all their money to? Other countries. There's just no transparency. And yet when it comes to the average citizens' lives, hey, we need a backdoor into all your apps so we can read those encrypted messages. That's the latest bill in Australia now.
Oh, man. Yeah, that's incredibly worrying, right? And obviously because they're part of the Five Eyes, it means that the US or New Zealand can lodge a request through Australia and spy on other people's information and stuff. And it's just this kind of... I actually did a video on this the other day, and it was, they're saying about terrorism, right? But in Australia, only 6 people have died from terrorism since 2001. Only 6 people.
You're more likely to get eaten by a camel, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. In the same time that, 15 people have been killed by sharks.
Yeah.
I do not see the government out there saying you're not allowed to get in the ocean because there's a shark out there, right? Or we have to take away your privacy.
Yeah.
because you might get bitten by a shark at some point.
And this bill just doesn't work. You talk to people in the tech industry, and they're going to get a letter from the government that says you need to put a back door in, and they're going to go, "What? If I put this in, the other guys that order the code are going to notice. My employee's going to notice. I get fired if I get caught. It just everyone is not going to want to start.
But now you get fired if you get caught, but you get fined if you don't do it. And you potentially get sent to jail if you don't do it.
So
if you try and say, "Hey, they're trying to make me do this," you also get sent to jail.
Yeah. And what message does that send to any tech company that might be thinking about hiring an Australian or setting up camp in Australia? We're not going to go there anymore. We're going to go to Asia, as we spoke about earlier.
That's exactly right. And this is where decentralized systems come in, because the fundamental problem is that there are these systems that can just be easily co-opted by governments, and they can easily be spied in on by governments. And we've seen that there has been some of the tech companies that have been willing to work with them. Facebook, for example, as a great example. Facebook got a lot to answer for, but they've been totally working with government in terms of letting them spy on people and all these different things. Whereas some of them have actually taken a stronger stance. Apple, I'm not an expert on Apple. Apple might have done some stuff, but I know that they have taken quite a few stances against letting the government crack their encryption.
Yeah. I think that's a good place to wrap up there, Lark, on the AA bill. Do you have any other final thoughts, or any other areas that you really see the intersection of crypto and politics coming to the forefront in 2019?
It's in 2019 coming to the forefront. That's a tricky one, but there's so many spaces where, from data security and all this stuff, one thing that really gets me excited, and I keep coming back to this as a use case because I think it's so important, is anti-corruption and land registry. Because in Australia and New Zealand, we've got our own little corruption issues, but we're relatively uncorrupt, relatively speaking, right? There's still corruption, but we don't do too bad. But you go to places like Indonesia, Russia, even though Russia's been improving its corruption meter, it's still pretty bad. Ukraine's absolutely horrendous. And so imagine if we could have a situation of transparent public bureaucracy, right, where we could do away with some of this corruption. Because the more transparency you bring in, the more light you bring into dark places, the harder it is to do crime. I mean, it's this really simple metric I remember hearing about that I think it was in South Africa, in some of the slum areas, they put in streetlights. You never guess what happened to crime. Crime rates dropped dramatically because it wasn't no longer easy to just walk up to somebody and steal their money because they could see you coming, right? And I think blockchain can bring that same kind of light to corrupt nations. It can bring that same kind of light to people who are trying to forge land registries, because that's a big problem in a lot of developing nations like Indonesia. They just burn your land registry. If you even had one to begin with, they just burn it and then they take your land.
We spoke to a project that's in East Africa where they get a shipment of food and it sells out in the first day or two, but the shop owners can't borrow money or go into debt to expand their business like you can in a Western country. So they get a shipment once a month, and this project is trying to, with the help of blockchain technology, allow them to order maybe once a week. Maybe they could order every day. Can you imagine? Food for a corner store, and then all those people can eat, and then all those people can maybe start their own little side businesses, and all of a sudden it all just starts flourishing, all because of the supply chain and the banking system, which is non-existent in East Africa.
That's it. And this is one thing I always say is that, for us in New Zealand or Australia or the United States or whatever, like, crypto's cool, and there's actually a lot of use cases for efficiencies and all these things, but the real market for crypto, the one that's going to take us, to the moon and beyond, it's the developing nations, because they're going to totally leapfrog existing banking infrastructure. They're going to totally leapfrog the old supply chain systems. They're going to totally leapfrog, old data, old social media, all that stuff, because they're not going to need it. And there will be new models that are incentivized, gamified, transparent, and all this stuff. So anybody who's not excited about the future of blockchain, you're crazy.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you coming on today, mate. It's always a pleasure, and I love that you are so knowledgeable on politics.
Well, I appreciate you coming on too, Alex. It's always a good time, man. Always a good time, without a doubt.
And I hope you have a good Christmas and New Year's, and I hope the crypto markets give us a better 2019. It has been tough this year.
For sure. Hope, fingers crossed that the STO markets will bring the next good times in.
Yeah, all those developing nations. That's what we really want.
Yeah.
Cool.
Adoption. adoption's where it's at.
Thanks
All
for
right,
tuning in,
bye
guys.
everybody.
See ya.